Well, on this day that has become one of the biggest holidays, not just in the US, but now around the world, I want to just extend a symbolic hug to those of you that fall into one of these four groups. If you would call yourself a fan of the Detroit Lions, the Texans, the Jaguars, or the Browns, not only have you not seen your team win a Super Bowl, you've never seen them play in one. These are the only four franchises left, and my heart goes out to you because I was born in Cleveland, Ohio. And so this is the depressing day for me every year on the Super Bowl. I get a little bit irritated and agitated. And if you are a fan of one of those four, it also means you are a deeply loyal person and you know pain and suffering as well. I think for me, that's one of the things that's challenged my faith the most. I'm like, God does not have a plan for the Cleveland Browns. Like, nobody does, clearly. He does not love that team. It's just tough. And then you throw into the mix that there are now millions of fans who know no other reality, because those are fans of Taylor Swift that are like, what's the big deal? Like, we just do this every year. Every year we go to the Super Bowl, and it's like, oh, you'll just never know the pain. But it is what it is. Love or hate the Chiefs, it's obviously a significant day. I think being the Browns fan has taught me a lot in life, and one of those things is that you can't build something that lasts on a foundation of quick fixes. We're starting a new series called Built to Last today. The Browns constantly leverage their future, the big dream of winning a Super Bowl, in hopes that this year might just be a little bit better than last year. We had 4 starting quarterbacks this past year. We've had 34 in 2 decades. We're just a mess. Whereas like the Chiefs, they're built to last, right? They're the best run organization in the NFL. They're worth $3.7 billion now. They signed Patrick Mahomes to a 10-year contract. That never happens in a physical sport like NFL. Like, they just do things other teams don't do. They traded away the best receiver in the NFL for a whole bunch of value. His name is Tyreek Hill. Everybody's like, they've given up on Patrick Mahomes. He's going to be exposed. And they have not lost a football game in the playoffs since trading this guy away 3 years ago, which is crazy. The Browns would have given him all their money and then traded Tyreek away to Frito-Lay for a bag of Doritos. That's just like, that's what we do. But I'll just keep lamenting around them as long as I have the microphone, so I'll move on. Luckily, this series, Built to Last, it is not a series about football, nor is it even a series about leadership or anything like that. We are specifically talking about relationships and relationships that have a romantic bent. We felt like the timing was appropriate with all of the holidays this week. Not only is it the Super Bowl, but got Valentine's Day on Friday. So guys, just a heads up, Amazon Prime can still get you a lot of things by Friday if it wasn't on your radar. Saturday is National Singles Awareness Day, which I find to be a unique holiday because I have a lot of single friends. They're all very aware of that fact. Some are very proud of it, some lament it, but I mean, they know, like, they don't need to be more aware. But that's coming this week. So we're like, why not kick off this 3-part relationship series, especially realizing that we live in a culture where deep, meaningful relationships that are built to last are no longer the norm in our culture. It's a culture of like instant, quick fix, of low commitment, like this is surrounding us, all the messages that come our way. Let's have a real conversation about this. You could say the North Star for this type of romantic relationship, that one that we're talking about, is a word that maybe is becoming a little bit more old school, but we could say it's intimacy, that's the goal. And I think it's helpful to define intimacy because that can be taken a lot of different ways as well. How we're going to use it in this series is really to know and to be fully known. And to be in that relationship where I know all of you, like the good, the bad, the ugly. I know your strengths, I know your weaknesses, I know your insecurities, you know mine. We've hurt one another, we've extended grace and forgiveness to one another, and we've committed in that space for life. We may not have that language to say that's what our heart desires, but that's in us, it's wired into so many of us. And at some point in any stage of relationship, there gets to be this moment where good enough is just no longer good enough. To say we've kind of figured out how to kind of coast. Maybe we fight a little bit less. Really, we're just more conflict avoidant. We just get so busy, or we focus on the kids or focus on our careers. But at some point when there's that intimacy gap, it's going to rear its head. It's like hitting a brick wall, and we're going to ask a different set of questions. And our point is, what if we can get ahead of that and talk about how it is that we build these types of relationships? Now, in today's message in particular, we're launching into one of 3 pillars. And we're going to talk about these pillars that are really transcendent, whether you are single, dating, engaged, married, or looking to be married again. This may be a series that is a bit of a tune-up for some of us that, oh, we haven't had that conversation in a while. That's a good idea or a good question. For some of us, I think this series will be very challenging. And I think that's okay. I think for some of you, you might hear some things that you disagree with. Your inner lawyer will be high, things that upset you. And I think we can disagree and we can still be friends. I think being challenged is oftentimes a step towards going down a different path or writing a different story. And so I'm excited for some of the difficult conversations, honestly. Today has maybe more landmines than any of them because our topic specifically is exclusivity. And I'm not talking about the stage of a dating relationship where you're like not quite committed yet, but you're also not dating anybody else. I'm talking specifically about physical and emotional exclusivity in the context of a romantic relationship today, which also means I hope if you're here with us, you came in, saw the PG-13 sign. This is kind of a warning for those of you online talking about physical intimacy. We're going to have some of those PG-13 conversations. We've got Wombaland and Upstreet and Transit open. Although I know based on type of parents, some of you want to go get your kid out of transit, and you're like, come sit next to me and hear this. So I know there's a range of that, but I want to let you know up front where we're headed. And I've made some bold statements so far when I'm like, we're not really in a culture that's conducive to these types of relationships. And I want to validate that a little bit as we get going because it's helpful to understand kind of this giant boulder that we are on that is going downhill, that is full of momentum, to understand kind of the history that we're standing on, the messages that are ingrained into our psyche at this point. Because we're about 100 years into an experiment that is not that long when you think about the scope of human history. When what I mean by that is in the 1920s is when dating became popularized in our country. Somebody coined the term in a magazine, the automobile was invented, you could have more privacy, go more places. And I find it kind of interesting that we didn't even make it a full decade until the Great Depression hit. I don't know if those two are synced, dating in the Great Depression or not, but it was definitely a change in approach and strategy. I mean, for example, this was kind of the new philosophy to relationships. It was a belief that I'll just know. I'll just know when I found the right person. I'll know in my gut and my heart. I'll know when I'm ready to settle down, and I'll know how to make it work. Like once I'm in the relationship, we'll be able to figure it out. And it's just interesting to me because committing to a person for life is maybe the most important decision you'll make next to following Jesus. And I just think if a doctor came into the room and was like, hey, nobody's really ever told me I'm certified to do this kind of surgery. I have no experience, but my heart will tell me what I should take out when I get in there. Like you would run, right? I mean, this is one of the most important decisions you can make with your life. And it's a whole new approach and strategy. And so that was a really big point in the timeline. Another one, and I know there's some landmines around this as well. I'm just more telling the historical timeline. In May 1960 was when the FDA approved the first birth control pill. Lots of reasons for that, right? Lots of medical uses. But one of the either intended or unintended consequences was the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s, as one of the major consequences of physical intimacy seemed to go down, or the risks seemed to go down. You add to that January 1st of 1983, which was the birthday of the internet. And that's taken us down two different roads in this conversation. On one, it is easier than ever to have low risk, low emotional exposure types of relationships. You just think about swipe left, swipe right. You think about DMs. You can just ghost people, stop replying. I mean, more than ever, it's almost like a shopping cart to choose the person that you want to hook up with or connect with. That's one path of this. The other path is pornography going from magazines onto the internet, being more visually stimulating with video, with time. And I don't have the words to put into consequence how significant it is that today's middle schooler with an iPhone can see as many naked bodies in an hour as the kings of old could see in a lifetime. There's just nothing to accurately describe the impact on our psyche, our expectations of relationships, our understanding of intimacy, and in particular, physical intimacy. The world has evolved rapidly, which is why I say that a lot is working against us in this area. And my question would be, has unlimited options and unlimited freedom actually made for more fulfilling relationships or not? Did you know that in 1960, less than 1% of people lived together before marriage, and today it's over 70%? In one lifetime, we went from almost nobody to almost everybody does that. It's so normal. But in that same period, the divorce rate has tripled. The happiness in the United States has been going down since the 1970s. Is there a potential that all of these are connected? While I realize it is a very complicated conversation, I would also like to suggest that enough is on the table that we should at least be curious, at least wonder, is this great experiment working, or is there perhaps a different way? Which is why I would like to introduce you to an option this morning that has been around for thousands of years, that has been in success across different cultures, across different continents over those 2,000 years. And specifically, they come from the words of Paul, one of the authors who wrote about a third of our New Testament. Basically, what he does in almost every single one of these letters is he shares the gospel, and then he talks about the implications of the gospel. Here's how to apply it in your life. And this is what he's doing for these new believers in Corinth, and he's talking about how do we use this ethic of Jesus and how it is that Jesus loved us, how do we love others around us that way. And his passage is specifically about physical intimacy. The conversation today is broader than that, but part of the reason he focuses so much on physical intimacy is in the Christian worldview, that's like the culmination of other forms of intimacy. There's established relational, intellectual, and emotional intimacy first that culminates in the physical. I realize we're in a culture that really kind of flips that script, but for him, he would be going to one of the deepest forms of intimacy here. And he writes these words to kind of start the conversation in this section. He says, I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but I will not be mastered by anything. Which is now a concept that applies to so many different moral areas of our life. He's writing to this audience, it's like you have a new identity in Christ. Yes, how you behave in this area does not have a bearing on God's love for you. It's not a heaven or hell conversation. Yes, the old 613 laws are applied differently today, but what are you going to do with that freedom? And there are natural consequences to following God's will for our life and natural consequences to being like, no, I've got it figured out. I'm going to go my own way. And you see that the conversation dials into this conversation of physical intimacy in verse 14 when he says, the body, however, is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. By his power, God raised the Lord from the dead, and he will raise us also. Okay, Paul, how did we just switch from sexual immorality to resurrection? How are those two things connected? And his point here, of course, is that sex is more than just physical because you are more than just physical. Physical is not bad in Christianity. That's really important. And a lot of worldviews it is. It's seen as dark or dirty, and spiritual is like enlightened. God made a physical universe. He made physical people. We will be physical in a physical heaven. It's not bad. It is good, but you are more than just physical. And he's pulling in eternity. He's saying it's not just live it up and then you die and nobody remembers you anyways and it's light out. He's like, no, there's so much more to you. Now, I think it's important to acknowledge as well that based on your church context, based on your religious upbringing, there are a lot of us who have experienced a lot of shame around this conversation, a lot of legalism around this conversation. And I think it's just a helpful note. It's not the full point of today's message, but it's helpful to note that there's a theme from beginning to end throughout the scriptures that sex in its proper context is good and powerful. Do you know, just Bible trivia-wise, what is the first command of the Bible? Not the first of the 10 commandments, just the first command in the Bible in Genesis 1. Genesis 1:28, God says, be fruitful and multiply. The first command is go and have lots of sex. That should at least pique our curiosity to what comes after, right? In 1 Corinthians 7, so this is the next chapter from the one we're looking at today. So same author, you see some of Paul's heart in this. He's writing to married couples is the context. And in 1 Corinthians 7, he says, do not deprive each other of sexual relations unless you both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy for a limited time so you can give yourselves more completely to prayer. So he's basically saying, hey, married couples, have a lot of sex. Stop to pray only and then continue. That's like his formula, right? There's this very positive, good, beautiful theme within its proper context. I would say it's good and powerful when we understand what it is to be designed for. So then we just ask, okay, well, what is the context? And he gives more clarity as we continue in 1 Corinthians 6. He takes what seems like another left turn, and he says, do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute, okay, wait, we were just talking about resurrection. Now, Paul, we're not uniting. What is this? It's just sex. Like, what are you talking about? He says, he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body. For it is said the two will become one flesh. Now, this reference to the prostitute unlocks so much about the audience and how it is that they relate to us today. It's really important. But before I get there, I just want to unpack this one flesh idea because it's a new phrase here. Throughout the scriptures, you see this term same flesh. Same flesh refers to your children. Same flesh might be your brother, sister, same DNA. One flesh is only reserved for a unique relationship within the marriage covenant. It is that sacred space where there is a sharing of stories, a sharing of lives, a sharing of hopes, dreams, failures, flaws, insecurities, where grace and forgiveness are extended to one another, and you're saying, I am in this for life. It is the mingling of persons, of identities, the mingling of souls, that intertwining. It is a unique, very specific relationship, which is why I say the physical is bigger, right, than just, or that intimacy is bigger than just physical. Because people have had sexual experiences that are not intimate, and people have had intimate experiences that are not sexual. So it goes bigger than that. That's why we use this definition right up front to say intimacy is to know and to be known fully. It is that oneness that Paul is talking about here. I saw one psychologist talk about it this way. He said, casual sex is an oxymoron. Like it doesn't actually make sense. It's not a real possibility, because in order to engage in casual sex with a person you don't really know, you have to treat them like a commodity, an object, and they have to do the same to you. I'm just going to use you for my pleasure, and you've agreed to do the same with me. I have to devalue both of us in that scenario. Here's why this matters so much and is actually freeing to understand. It's not just religious speak. When two people have come together in that way and they don't know one another, admiration without knowledge actually leads to loneliness over time. You see this in all kinds of different places, right? You think about social media. That's why social media leads to such loneliness. People admire you, they like your stuff, they follow you, but they don't know you, and it actually increases loneliness over time. This happens to people in positions of leadership. This happens to CEOs. This happens to pastors that think there's some kind of victim and nobody understands me and I'm in a unique position, and all of a sudden it adds to loneliness over time. The same is true with sexual intimacy. To be admired, but to be not known adds to loneliness, adds to complexity over time. The psychologist said sex was never designed to be in the space of, I don't know if you're going to be there in the hotel room in the morning. I'm worried because I don't know your medical history. I worry once a month because I'm not sure you're the person I want to start a family with. I wonder if we go there, are you going to leave because I think that's all you want from me? That's not what sex was designed for. It's designed for that sacred space of we're in it for life. I've hurt you, you've hurt me, but we're going nowhere. And we can be our full selves. And in that sacred space is what it was ultimately designed for. Now you hear that, and then you might think, okay, well, let's apply some recency bias, right? Because that's so old school, we've advanced, we're more sexually progressive, we've learned a lot since then. And here's where I would really challenge or push back on that. This is why that reference to the prostitute is so important. He's writing to the city of Corinth, where the temple of Aphrodite would house at any given time 1,000 prostitutes. It was not uncommon in this culture for a husband to go home from a stressful day at work, stop by the local brothel, and then go and see his wife and kids. And everybody would know because it would be in a public space. My brother and I, in 2016, he invited me on his senior trip when he graduated from college. And I went with him, and we went to Pompeii, which is about a 15-hour drive away from Corinth. And it's preserved in the year 8070 because that's when the volcano went off. And we went through, and this tour guide took us, and we went inside this brothel right here, which I think is very important to communicate, hasn't been active in 2,000 years, right? But we went in here, and I can't even show you the pictures from inside of this place, the murals that are above every room, so graphic, so R-rated. And our tour guide said along this cobblestone path, there's the brothel right there, and then that little bridge on the other side, that's the marketplace. That's where you'd pick up your groceries. I mean, that's just like how common it was in this culture. Way more sexually progressive. Don't have any Christian ideas influencing how relationships work at this point in these kinds of contexts and cultures. You could say it's really kind of flipped, because you and I might stand here and we might think, man, this conversation feels old school. Like the idea of waiting for marriage, I mean, obviously nobody does that. Exclusivity paves the way to intimacy. No, sex is sacred. Like, we just need to get with the times and realize, like, just make sure it's mutual. Which is a really interesting bar, by the way, because people make mutual bad decisions all the time. I mean, it should be a part of the conversation, but not the only part. Practice makes perfect, and This is where I would say some of this is like not even our faults, right? Maybe your parents told you, you need to make sure that you're sexually compatible, right? I mean, this is just the message we've received. It's not our fault. It's the culture we live in. The idea that sex is just physical. It's like a high five or tackle football or just take that as you will. You know, it's just, this is the idea. And while it may be true that your grandma or your great-grandma was a little old school, your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandma was an animal. Okay? It was the opposite. It was a total flip. Paul was writing to a culture, and he was saying, hey, what if God has a different way? What if this thing that is good and powerful is designed for a specific relationship? What if exclusivity paves the way to intimacy, that there is a one you are committing in a unique way emotionally and physically to? And what if sex does have a sacred element because there's a sacredness to you and there's a sacredness to the one who died for you and who made you? See, this dance that he does back and forth, this challenge and callback to identity, it's just fascinating. It seems confusing if it's your first read through, but it's actually so helpful and beautiful what Paul does. In verse 17, he goes from this verse about the prostitute to the Lord. He says, but whoever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit. Meaning this intimacy that you were made for in this one relationship, it mirrors the intimacy that God desires with you, the relationship that he wants with you. Paul, throughout this whole passage, does this challenge, this kind of gut punch, this kind of everybody in the room's uncomfortable. And then he immediately calls you back to your identity. Here's this thing that's hard to hear, but don't forget who you are. Here's this thing that's not emotionally satisfying, but don't forget whose you are. He does this dance in this whole passage. And you see it again in verse 18. He gives these very, very practical challenge. And he's like, flee. We're called to treat sexual sin different than any other type of sin. Just get out of there, end the opportunity, move, close the lap, whatever it is, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. And then in verse 19, right back to our identity. In verse 19, he says, do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. Let's say basic economics tells us that the value of anything is what somebody is willing to pay for it. You were bought with what I would say is the highest price, the person of Jesus himself on the cross for your sins and for mine. Meaning this conversation matters not because you've done things in your past that have devalued you, or now God loves you less, or he's disappointed with you. It matters because you have so much value in his eyes that the conversation is worth it, even if it's an uncomfortable one. I mean, I would just like to ask, what if, even if this has to be a thought experiment for you, you're new to church today, you're like, I just don't connect with that emotionally. Like, what if God really does love you and wants the best for you? Like he's not trying to like test and control you and manipulate you. He's not just trying to restrict all the fun out of your life to see if you love him or not. What if he designed you, knows what you are made for, and is just giving you the context behind this thing that is good and powerful? I mean, again, the world would end if one generation stopped, right? Of course it's good and powerful, but he's telling us what it is used for. I would suggest, even if you're sitting here and you're like, no, see, this is why I don't like church. This is like so old school. This is 2025. Everything wrong with religion. I would still say one thing that you and I can probably agree on is no matter your worldview, you agree sex needs restraints. Nobody's arguing that rape is not okay, that sexual abuse is not okay. You can't just walk up in public and make an advance on anybody that you are attracted to. You go to prison for that, right? Like we understand there needs to be some restraints. We're just suggesting God has been clear about what that line is, what its proper context is, because sex outside of the context of marriage tends to complicate things. It complicates things in our stories. It complicates things with people that we care most about. It's good and powerful, but it has a context. You are 60% water. We are all 72 hours away from dying if we don't get more water in our systems, right? But water unrestrained, incredibly destructive. This is the idea. Everything that is good has a place, a time, a context. Now, again, this passage focuses so much in on the physical element of exclusivity, on the physical element of intimacy. but it is broader than that. The bottom line, or the pillar of part one today, is that relationships that last are built upon exclusivity. And we're going to actually grow this statement over the course of this series. This is just one of the pillars. It's not the only thing that makes a relationship last, but it's one of the pillars. And part of the reason I know it goes beyond just the physical is because of what Jesus says about marriage in Matthew 19. Every wedding that I've ever gotten to officiate, I always have shared Matthew 19. Lack of creativity, but it's just the clearest and most straightforward on what marriage is in Jesus' eyes. And Paul gets these ideas from what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 19. He says, in the context that's not about physical intimacy, he says, haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Interestingly enough, he's quoting Genesis, and in the Genesis narrative, Adam and Eve don't have parents, meaning it is a prescription for future generations. It is a description of the ideal. And Jesus closes this section by saying, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. It is exclusive, unique to this one committed relationship. Now, in a lot of the ceremonies that I've gotten to be a part of as well, they're really fun. Like, there's just so much hope, so much idealism. A lot of oftentimes in a marriage ceremony, somebody will choose to do kind of this symbolic moment somewhere in the middle that's like a unity candle where you take, two flames and come together, and it's symbolic of two becoming one. Or a sand ceremony is a little bit more of like a modern way to do that. And the first wedding I ever got to do, I won't forget for multiple reasons. I mean, it was my first wedding. It was of some good friends of ours. I also thought the photographer was going to kill me because I didn't jump out of the way when they kissed at the end. So I'll never make that mistake again. I was very embarrassed. But now today I just run. But I have so many fun memories of this first day. And I remember too, they did a sand ceremony in that wedding. And this is a picture of that. This is not a stock photo, by the way. This is my friends Tori and Christian, and this was the sand ceremony that they did in their wedding. And the idea of a sand ceremony, it's symbolic to say that as our lives merge with one another, as we share our stories, as we are emotionally vulnerable, as we are physically vulnerable with one another, it's like our stories, our hopes, our dreams, our insecurities, our families, they're all becoming one. And yes, we still maintain a unique identity with unique gifts and talents and all of that, but at the same time, it would be as impossible for me to separate this out with all of the different grains and sands of there, right, as it would be to end this now permanent committed relationship. That's kind of the symbol of it, right? Now, let's say at the same time that you're in a relationship, maybe with somebody in college, the person that you are going to end up with someday, they're out there in their own college on the other side of the country. They're in a relationship as well. Maybe these two are Kansas City Chiefs fans. I really didn't even plan that, but it's just the colors work appropriately. So you've got these two, and the 4 years of college end, and we go get jobs and go our separate ways, or we feel like we've grown up, or whatever it might be. And let's say, as we kind of expect a lot of those young relationships to, it ends. And we break up, and we go back our own separate ways, although now that person is like a part of me. And there's like a part of me that goes with them. There are now these memories, there are these connections, there are these expectations that I'm going to bring into the next relationship. There are some things that I honestly liked from that relationship that I'm kind of going to pressure the next person to do, if you will. And so we go, and we both got these stories kind of combined together now. And let's say, they just, for time and simplicity, the next person that you meet is the person you marry. And I really don't mean to ruin sand ceremonies for you. That's not my point. If you did one, it really is beautiful. But I just think I'm more honest. If we're just being real, none of us have been the ideal in this area at all times. You now have entered into the relationship a little bit of somebody who isn't a part of the relationship. And you've combined some of that complexity and some of those expectations and some of those memories and some of those images that you have in your head. And I share this illustration not to shame you, but to say, based on stage of life, if you're early 20s and your plan, just the message you've been told, what you see online is, I'm going to spend the next decade just living it up, just figuring what I like, just traveling around the world and just doing with kind of whatever, whenever I want. Well, I'm just telling you in a loving way, you're going to wind up in your 30s and you do this 10 times or 100 times. There is a level of complexity coming in your future and maintaining the most important relationships. You're going to wonder where that came from and how that got there, and you thought you did what everybody told you to do, but perhaps that messaging isn't so helpful. If you're already like, well, this is my story, I mean, is that times 100, like this feels really not helpful? I think what I'm suggesting for you is some of us are struggling with intimacy today, and we've never connected it to our past story. We've never realized that part of what's present is a past memory, is a past tie, is a past relationship. And maybe what we do need is some help, is some healing, is some counseling, is to share at the right time in the appropriate context to realize what is in there, because I've made this transition to oneness complex. And I share that just hopefully more in a way forward when you're wondering what is wrong and what is this gap and what is it that we keep running into. Now, as you're trying to navigate this, I tried to split this application almost into two groups of people, like not currently married, and then the team after first service was like, both those applications kind of apply to both groups. So take this as you will, but as you're trying to navigate this, as we're trying to take the real of our stories with some of the ideal that we're painting, I think one possible application is to define your boundaries before you need them. First service, I said this kind of applies to if you're single, dating, engaged, looking to be married again, but really this is true to married people as well. This is the idea to say, before I've gotten to that line, I'm going to decide physically, emotionally, these are the lines. If I'm in a relationship, if I am dating, we're going to have conversations about what those boundaries are. I'll be honest with you, when I was 17 years old, Emily and I, we started dating really young. We were in high school. I wasn't a Christian. I didn't grow up in church. She was. And so she had this conversation with me. I remember where we were, because it's now a painful conversation in memory, because I did end up marrying her especially. We were at a light, and Leander, and she brought up the idea of boundaries. And I had never heard that term or phrase before in that context. I don't know if it's just because I was young or because I didn't grow up in church. It was so weird to me. And I remember she shared, because we were thinking about like making it official, being boyfriend and girlfriend. I remember laughing. And then I just remember telling her, like, yeah, I just don't think that's realistic. Like, I just don't think people do that today. 2 years later, I'm at a conference. I'm a freshman at the University of Texas. And there's this guy on stage, and it's only dudes in the room, and he's challenging the room. And he says, I want you to picture waking up the day after your wedding day with your now bride for the very first time. And I want you to think in that moment, will you wish that you had 100 more tapes in your head? Will you wish that you had just 10 more? Just one more tape in your head to compare her to? Or will you be grateful that at some point in your story, regardless of your past in this area, you put a stake in the ground and you fought for her? Your now best friend who you've committed your life to, potential mother of your children. What do you want to do with that? And he stood up off his chair and he looked at the room and he said, don't you dare get in another relationship with a woman without committing to not being a regret for her. And I'm like, I'm a 3-year regret for Emily. Like, I just haven't treated her well this whole process. I've been non-committal. I got coffee with her at Einstein Bagels on the drag near campus, and in tears. Like, I'm crying as I'm saying this to her, and she's like, there's people around, like, keep it together. I'm in tears apologizing for that specific conversation and the pattern with which I've treated her, disrespected her, dishonored her, pressured her over those last 3 years, asked for her forgiveness and said, I would like to date you. I'm done with this talking crap. Like, we've done that for 3 years. Like, I would like to date you. I'd like you to be my girlfriend. The next 3 years, I had set boundaries that were even more extreme than the ones that she had thrown out. That 3-year window, while not perfect, was such a gift, and I want to say more of a gift to me as the guy. I know genders are all over with this, but I just think for me as the guy to have a space, a window where we weren't wondering, are our roommates going to be home when we get home? How is this all going to work? But like the point of the date was just the date, to get to know and discover her. Like her sense of humor, she's hilarious. Her work ethic, her integrity, her selflessness, her wisdom. Like, she became my best friend in that window. And I would never trade those last 3 years of college for anything in the world. I just think if you haven't had a before-after kind of moment where you're not committing to perfection, but you're committing to fight for an ideal, that defining the boundaries ahead of time might be helpful for you. Where? Spaces. Where are we going to? Who knows, right? What are those lines? Have we drawn them out? If you're married, and this is where, again, this actually can apply if you're single as well, but if you're married especially, the challenge I want to give to you is to burn the ships. This comes from a chapter in a book called What Radical Husbands Do, and it comes from this story in the 1500s of a Spanish commander who sailed the ocean, made landfall, got off, and he turned to his generals, and he said, burn the ships, burn our own ships. Meaning there is no escape route. We win this war or we don't go home, but we're not going to retreat and go back. So if you have already committed to somebody for life, my challenge to you is to burn the ships. And this is so wide-ranging. We can exaggerate to other people and hide from other people, but just at least be honest with yourself. There are so many applications here. This can be as small as like you follow on somebody on social media and you really don't know why. It's an ex that you haven't talked to in 10 years, and you kind of just like to keep up with what they're doing in their life, and there's that fantasy that just kind of goes. It's a celebrity, like, unfollow them. That's so easy to do. It could be a relationship that your spouse has been challenging for a long time and asking questions, and they're trying not to be controlling. Burn the ships. It's not worth it. Maybe in the more extreme, you need to switch jobs or you need to move neighborhoods or whatever it might be, but burn the ships. If there is a guy at work who is the one that you vent to about your husband, burn that ship. It's not heading in a good direction. For the end goal, for the ultimate goal, if pornography is still a part of your story, burn the ship. And I know that's not as easy for most people as just turning off. Maybe that's getting help, that's being honest about that struggle, but burn the ship because it's getting into the bedroom, it's impacting expectations, whether you want to admit to it or not. Burn the ship. Maybe it's not even in the emotional, physical intimacy realm. Maybe it is something that the book talks about, some chapter or some examples like there's something you're just giving your heart to, like sports or video games or work or romance novels. And it's like the idea that like I'm giving my heart to this and then I'm upset with my spouse afterwards. Or your wife is desperate for your attention and you spent hours last night playing, like burn the Xbox if she wants more of your attention. Right? That's the idea, to say you are all in. There is no escape route. You have made a commitment for life to love one another as Christ has first loved you. Now, based on where your mind goes with that, that can be really hard. And you might want to push back, and you might want to say, well, what about and what if, and you don't know them and so on. I think the one caveat that feels important to make in this conversation is yes, if it is a situation of physical, sexual, emotional abuse, I'm not saying you are trapped in that for a lifetime because you're a follower of Jesus. That is not what I'm saying. But I'm talking about you have dreams of making this work and we've stagnated or we've got busy or my mind is drifting or my fantasies are getting bigger or whatever it is. There's that person I'm looking forward to seeing. I'm talking about those. Burn those ships. You will never, never regret it. And as I share that, because I know that also is hard for a lot of us to hear, here's the tension I was wrestling with in preparation for this message this week. On one hand, I know that creates a certain sense of conviction for many of us, maybe a sense of shame and guilt, and I don't totally want to resolve that. As somebody who cares for you, I do think that is sometimes the nudge of God to start writing a different story, to put a stake in the ground and to do something different. I don't want to smooth over that entirely. And I also understand there's a uniqueness to this conversation. If I was going to say, hey, today we're going to talk about lying, we all lie sometimes, we should lie less. You'd all be like, yes, I agree. There's no emotional weight to that. There's an emotional weight to this conversation. It's tied to our identities probably more than it should be and so on, but I understand that. And I just want to leave you with this final verse as we head out of here today, where Isaiah is talking about the person of Jesus. If you're wanting to hide from him, if you're wanting to look away from him, if you're wanting him to not see you right now, I just think he might be the very one to lean into. Because Isaiah says, Jesus was pierced for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. And by his wounds we are healed. Transgressions are like, I crossed the line. I did something. I physically crossed the line. I went there. Iniquity is like internal. It's the internal fantasies, it's the internal temptations, it's the guilt and the shame. He was bruised, which comes up internally. This conversation is not about your identity. It is not about how God sees you or how much he loves you. It is not a heaven or hell conversation. This conversation matters because you have so much value in God's eyes. You were bought at the highest price. He made you and designed you, and he knows what's best for you. And trusting him and leaning into him in this area of your life can result in a hard road, but something extraordinary on the other side. Bottom line, today, relationships that last are built upon exclusivity. Do you need to have a boundaries conversation with somebody? Do you need to burn some ships in your life this afternoon? Don't wait till Wednesday or you'll wait 10 more years. This afternoon, do you need to burn some ships in your life and see what it is that God might have for you in your story? Would you pray with me? Father, this is one of those just complicated conversations because it almost feels like it shouldn't be had in just a one way. We have to be able to respond, to share our stories, to ask questions. And so I just pray that you meet us in all of those gaps. God, that we would feel your love and your grace in this conversation. God, that we'd be reminded, as Paul keeps doing, that we'd be reminded of our identity, that that's not on the line here. That we might be open to seeking help or having a conversation or talking with our group or talking with the counselor, just knowing we're not alone in this, and that you love us. You just love us enough to show us what we're made for, what we're designed for, and to call us back to you. And I hope that's what happens as a result of this series the next couple weeks. God, we love you. We need you, and it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. Thank you guys for hanging and being a part of this combo. We'll see you next week for part 2.